And today I'm so thrilled that we are highlighting Tyler Revsland from the Wild Seed Project. He works as the manager of applied ecology and has lots of expertise in native plants and um, the benefits that they have in this age of climate change. So I'm going to let Tyler take it away.
Thanks, Suzanne. And thank you all for being here. Let me just move this window. Sorry. If you're not, I'm not sure the familiarity of folks in the audience, but if you're not familiar with Wild Seed Project, we are a small member-supported nonprofit located in North Yarmouth, Maine. And our mission is to help people repopulate their landscapes with native plants. And we do that through a couple core programs, um, including our seed stewardship, which is where we conserve and intend to improve access to native seeds by the public. We also have school and youth programs where we try and integrate native plant ecology into curricula at local schools and expand outdoor learning experiences. And we also have several different adult education programs that try and teach the process of the what we call the seed to seed cycle of collecting seed, sowing it, and taking care of plants so that they can further, um, fulfill their life cycle and create seeds themselves. So my talk today will be in three chapters of sorts, basically the why, the what, and the how of planting for climate resilience. And today I'll be focusing a lot on trees because they're really the first and arguably most important step for planning for climate resilience because they form the backbone of sorts of our yards, our gardens, our sort of broader landscapes, especially in Maine. But much of what I'll be talking about, the principles and sort of the lessons, are all applicable to other native plants. So your shrubs, your wildflowers, your ground covers. Definitely lessons to be used throughout your garden and your planting design. So first off, why is tree canopy cover, especially that from native plants, important for climate resilience? As we're all aware, the climate crisis is here, and we're sort of increasingly not acting on resolving it, unfortunately. Globally, the last 10 years were the 10 warmest on record. Every time I use this slide in talks, I need to make sure and look up what the most recent thing is. Last time I said the last 9 out of 11 years were the warmest. Now I unfortunately just get to say the last 10 of 10. Temps in Maine have risen almost 3.5 degrees since the beginning of the 20th century. And in particular, winter warming is um, really stark in a place like Maine. It's been about twice the amount of winter warming has been about twice the amount of summer warming in the state. And we've really lost cold nights, which used to be very commonplace in the summer and shoulder seasons, and they've been below average for the last quarter century. So we're really entering a new era of climate. And Maine is fortunate in a lot of ways in that because we're so far north and because our climate is moderated by the ocean, we've been buffered a little bit from the extremes. But that's not something that we can count on indefinitely going forward, as you know, some of the recent events that we've experienced highlight. And climate change doesn't only affect temperature, of course, it affects snowfall, and the frequency and intensity of rainfall. So not just more extreme wet periods, but also more extreme dry periods or snowless winters. As you know, we experienced in the winter of 2023, 2024, we had one of the lowest snowfalls on record. And this last spring, even though it was pretty normal, it felt normal, I think, to a lot of us. You can see in these two maps, the one on the left, that much of the Northeast was still higher temperatures than what would be normal for the spring. And parts of the region also experienced heavy rainfall that departed from normal, as you can see in the purple on the right map. And as I mentioned, we all remember January 2024 when we had record-breaking flooding, coastal storm surges across coastal Maine. And these storm damages really highlight the true cost of climate change going forward, and that these effects will mostly and certainly at first be placed on the shoulders of frontline communities and marginalized communities that are the least able to absorb those costs. So I think it really falls on those of us with the means to change our behavior, change our um, practices, even when it comes to our landscapes, to build more resilient landscapes um, and take part in the collective action of planting for climate resilience. Because this crisis really represents a threat to our shared ecosystem, it really takes that collective action to help withstand the stress and to recover as we continue to see and experience extreme weather events. And I just want to highlight that when I say withstand and recover, and that's kind of how I'm defining resilience, I think what we will see is events that kind of compound one another. So you may have a drought in the fall, followed by a flash flood in uh, April, to a summer with heat waves, and it can be this sort of sequence of events that are abnormal that are really the key to be resilient to. Like we need to plant according to this era that we now live in, which is these sort of sequential abnormal weather events that are going to become increasingly common. And by doing so, not only are we taking part in collective action that we all need, but we're helping to safeguard the habitat that exists, build new habitat, and help protect biodiversity and mitigate um, carbon dioxide emissions where we can, knowing that much bigger action needs to take place at the federal and state level, but knowing that we can also do our part when it's those of us that have the means to do so. So increasing tree cover is especially important in our urban and residential areas. We're coming from a baseline of a lot of impervious cover that provides no habitat value and no sort of value or buffering from these climate extremes compared to green infrastructure, green spaces that provide a lot of benefits. And again, I'm pointing out the tree benefits here, but really this goes for any sort of planting that you bring into your space, especially if you're clawing back some of that impervious surface. Um, Trees first help us adapt to this hotter and wetter world by helping curb the urban heat island effect. They can help reduce urban temperatures through shading by 2 to 4 degrees, and that can be up to 10 degrees in certain circumstances. Portland experiences temperatures in the summer that are upwards of 6 degrees warmer than the surrounding coastal sort of countryside. And trees, of course, are also very important for intercepting stormwater runoff during those extreme rainfall events and helping to clean and filter those extreme stormwater surges. Trees also help mitigate climate change effects by reducing peak energy usage. So if you think about AC usage during um, these heat waves during the summer, they can really help mitigate that. Even 6 degrees cooling is huge for whether a person decides to turn their AC on or not, or whether they can just go without during peak usage hours. Trees also help, of course, with carbon storage and mitigating the release of all this carbon dioxide. Um, and then finally, and perhaps the most obvious, is just providing habitat for wildlife. And I like to mention that it's not just other species that benefit, it's us as well. So increasing, more and more research comes out that shows how important green space is for our physical, mental, and social well-being. Um, Trees protect us from harmful UV rays, and green spaces in general provide places where people just want to hang out and want to be outside. No one wants to hang out in a parking lot or a scorched like sidewalk. They like to hang out under shade and in comfort. And so tree cover really helps provide those spaces for people to congregate and provide some attachment to place, which I like to point out in this time of being increasingly online, but ironically, increasingly disconnected. Creating those third places away from our homes and away from our workplaces is just so, so important going forward. So how do we go about doing this in our own spaces or in our collective spaces? I like to talk about three sort of key ingredients for creating climate resilient landscapes. The first is welcoming biodiversity in all its forms back into your space. The second is understanding your landscape, your garden, your backyard well enough so that you can pick suitable plants for that spot. And we'll go over some more details about that, about really all three of these. But that's the right plant, right place principle that has been a cornerstone in a lot of, native plant and more naturalized landscaping practices. And finally, kind of bringing this together is creating quality habitat. So habitat that's quality for humans and for other life, that's free from chemicals, that's complex, that provides layers of shelter for different animals, and provides quality food and water for all those um, different species of wildlife. When you have all of these three components together, that's when you start to see resilience. Um, and when you start to see that you have species that might disappear during certain, say, a really dry year or a particular wet year, but there's enough diversity there to pick up the slack and for other species to come in and be successful given their different adaptations. And just a quick note about native, what I mean by native. I think it's good to always be clear about what we mean by these things. So, what I mean by native is just plant species that have co-evolved with one another in our region for many millennia. So, they were here before colonization. Um, and by co-evolving with the wildlife, with other plants, fungi, bacteria, they're resilient to the pests and pathogens that naturally exist in Maine. They're resilient by and large to our climate, even though it's changing. There's a lot of sort of generalities about what it means to live in Maine that are useful from a plant survival perspective. And because of this, they really are um, the simplest and most straightforward way to start to build resilience. And I'll touch on this a little bit more later, but we do expand this definition to include what sometimes is called near natives. So native species that are from the mid-Atlantic or southern Appalachia. These are plants that have co-evolved with many of the same plants, animals, and other critters. But there'll be some differences, and of course, these plants will be a little bit better adapted for longer growing seasons, um, warmer summers, milder winters, that sort of thing. So they can come in and help buffer and help further the resiliency of a landscape by including them with our main natives. So kind of connecting these dots of the three ingredients and native trees, um, I argue that native trees fulfill all three of these ingredients really well, and they're that great jumping off point for designing your landscape in a way that will be resilient. It's a great place to start and then build off of with the rest of what you're going to plant in your space. So the first ingredient they check off because native tree species, there's over 65 native to Maine alone and over 135 native tree species to the Northeast. So there's a large pool of species to work with. And by biodiversity, I don't just mean the number of species, but what's really important and functional about biodiversity is that it encapsulates all sorts of adaptations of species. So three examples here from what an ecologist would call survival strategy. So plants can kind of be in different buckets in terms of the resources they put into reproduction, into growth, and into survival. So some of our native species, aspen, gray birch, pin cherry, are early establishers. They're adapted to disturbance. If a tree falls down and creates a gap in the canopy, that's the conditions that they love. Then you have keen competitors like red maple, basswood, tulip tree that put all their energy into growth and maximizing growth and competing with the vegetation around them. So they're really good about creating the structure of a forest and a lot of habitat. And finally is the resourceful scavengers, I like to call them, which are, a lot of shade tolerant trees, hemlock, striped maple, pagoda dogwood that do well as a subcanopy. And our rhododendrons are another good example of a tree tolerant of really acidic soil that is common to Maine and the Northeast. These species do well in creating the layers of habitat that are important for a natural landscape, for a resilient landscape that's benefiting not just humans, but all sorts of life. All right, and then moving on to the second and third ingredient, trees are great. This one's very kind of straightforward. They're adapted to our environmental conditions. Native trees are adapted to the various challenges of living in Maine, climate, acidic soils, pest pathogens, salt spray, all those sorts of things. So as long as we understand what we're planting them in and then select the species, rather than falling in love with a particular tree or plant and trying to coerce our site to fit them by, adding soil amendments or cutting down trees or doing whatever we can to coerce our environment. Um, if we do it in the inverse and follow right plant, right place principles, trees really fit the bill in fulfilling this component. And finally, as I mentioned before, trees really are the backbone of our habitat. They've co-evolved with the native flora and fauna, and they are the house, they are the structure that wildlife depends. Additionally, a lot of tree species are what we call keystone species. They play a disproportionately important role in providing food for our native butterfly and moth caterpillar species. So if you think of like Luna moths, um, other like large Saturnid moth species, or a lot of different butterfly species depend upon the unique chemistry of tree leaves to serve as food, but also a lot of our native pollinators. Many of us don't think about this, but a lot of our native pollinators depend on the spring flowers of trees for their nectar and pollen. Trees, of course, are this huge food source. They're like the largest grocery store around. And so there's a lot of food, and it's available early in spring when bees are trying to provision their nests. And so even though we can't see them, it's not as obvious as a bee visiting a rose. They're very important for those early pollinators. So here's just a photo example of these three principles in action. So here we have a biodiverse sort of woodland with paper birches in the background and rhododendrons, hemlock, maples, oaks, and blueberries in the foreground. And all very well adapted to acidic soil in Maine. The birches are loving that depression in the background that provides them a little bit more moisture that keeps them happy and healthy. And then the hemlock and red maple are creating the shade for subcanopy trees like rhododendron to do well. They're not facing a lot of stress from getting too much sunlight or being too exposed. Um, and so it's creating this multi-tiered habitat that's, quality habitat, that's biodiverse, and that everything is well adapted to its environment. And this is always something that I like to mention. Conventionally, especially in the sort of horticulture or landscape space, trees and I'm coming from sort of outside that space, so pardon my sort of bias here, but trees are oftentimes seen as decor, almost objects on our landscape, where we pick out individual trees. Oftentimes, they've even been referred to as specimen trees. And we typically plant them as individuals, kind of off on their own island, surrounded by mulch or lawn, or in little planting holes amongst our sidewalk. And this isn't a place where many trees are happy. It's a hard, harsh microclimate for them to exist in. And so what will happen is the tree will get stressed and it will be vulnerable to pests. And then sometimes we will spray to try and get rid of the pests, or we'll plant non-native trees because simply nothing eat them. They're not valuable to wildlife, and so they'll look pretty and healthy, but it's just because they're not benefiting anything else. So the cycle kind of perpetuates itself, and trees as decor or trees as objects really emphasizes the appearance, the fact that the tree is no cleanup, it's pest free, it's controllable, right? It's what some of us refer to as lollipop trees. They have their straight trunk and then they have their circle of greenery on top. And this prioritizes appearance above all else. And I would like us to shift. This isn't a complete 100% shift, but just step towards trees as habitat, trees as just one component of an ecosystem, oftentimes planted together with a subcanopy layer and canopy layer and understory plants. Nothing is sort of off on its own in an island. And these trees can be messy. They can drop branches and nuts and leaves because that all falls to the ground and forms another layer of habitat. Leaves and a duff layer that caterpillars will finish their life cycle in. Different wildlife will use these different components. They're not going to waste. And there'll be food for wildlife. So the leaves might get eaten. There might be tent caterpillars in the branches. They might not always look pristine, and that's okay. Some of this is just letting go a little bit of that control so that it makes room for a little bit more diversity on our landscape. So now I'll shift towards talking about some specific species, native species for your landscape. And I just want to preface by saying kind of what the status quo is. Fortunately, a lot of municipalities are increasingly incorporating native trees into what they plant in residential and commercial areas, and that's awesome. I think that is in response to public interest. That's in response to, different legislation that's passed and climate action plans. But I still think there's a lot of progress to be made. So just Portland as an example, and nothing is unique about Portland. In fact, in many ways, they've shifted a lot in the right direction. But almost 50% of the trees they recommend are still non-native tree species. And here's just an example of some of the ones that are on their website, from large, medium to small trees. And some I just want to point out, like European beech, non-native species of a scale insect, which now damages our native beech trees that causes beech bark disease. We also have beech leaf disease, which is caused probably by an invasive nematode or some other pathogen. Those were brought likely from non-native beech trees that were brought into North America. So that's one example of an unintended consequence of the promotion of non-native trees is not only are we planting those non-native, but we could put our native species at risk. Um, Chinese elm, which is also in that large tree um, subheading, is invasive, reported as invasive in several US states, not so in Maine yet. But some of these, depending on where you live, can be problematic. And so just something to keep in mind, and something that I think more, yeah, progress can be made on. Not to mention some of these species just aren't very hardy to climate extremes. The Katsura, which is in the medium tree section, is pretty intolerant of drought and late frosts, both of which Maine can certainly experience. And so sometimes this can just set us up for failure if we're picking plants that just aren't going to do well in our conditions. But one tree that certainly does do well in our conditions is Norway maple. Norway maple, as many of you know, is a non-native tree that was very much popularized by this cultivar in the upper left corner that has purple foliage. And you see these all over the place. They're not listed as well, they're no longer for sale in Maine, as I understand it, but they're still, you know, everywhere. And hopefully people have really curbed back planting them. But the problem with them is They leaf out extra early and drop their leaves extra late, which gives them an advantage over our native maples. And they cast really, really deep shade, which makes it difficult to create any layers of habitat underneath them. They basically shade everything out, and whatever they don't shade out, they outcompete by having really shallow root systems that compete for water and nutrients. So this is just an example of a particularly sort of aggressive non-native species that if you have them in the yard, it's not necessarily an urgent get out there and cut it down because they are a tree. They're still providing a lot in terms of shade, in terms of habitat for some animals. But as you think about replacing that tree, as you think about future landscape plans, and especially if you have young ones coming in, ones that you can cut down, I think that's definitely recommended, replacing them with some of the native trees I'll point out. So this isn't intended for you to read the fine print here. This is just a very short list of the variety of plants that we have available to us in Maine um, for all sorts of conditions. So in the upper left is sunny dry. Uh, upper upper right is sunny wet, and then we have shady dry in the bottom left and shady wet in the bottom right. And you have small and large trees, sort of a sampling of just some of the species available that are native. And I always like to really highlight oaks and willows and um, let's see, cherries are another example of these keystone species that are disproportionately important for wildlife and that provide a lot of food and shelter for a lot of different animals. So there's some of those on this list, in addition to shrubs like dogwood and viburnum, which provide the necessary fuel in terms of berries for migrating bird species in the fall when those berries become ripe. Um, a really excellent group of shrubs for placing kind of on woodland edges underneath your tree canopy. And I did promise that I would sort of circle back to planting more southerly located trees farther north and what that means. So some people will talk about, and the scientific community talks about this as assisted migration, so helping trees migrate to new climates where they don't currently exist. And really what I like to tell people is, first off, there's so much we don't know about this process, and um, a lot of scientists are actively looking at this problem, growing trees from seed, from southern genotypes, and doing trials to see how they grow, how they handle frost, heat, drought in more northern climates. And it's really a large scale effort that will have to take place to migrate sort of entire forest assemblages of trees to different locations on the continent. So that large scale is what we mean by assisted migration. But for you and your landscape, it does mean considering those near native trees. It can mean growing some trees from seed and just seeing which one grows best in your yard. That can be a fun thing to, especially if you have kids, kind of experiment with. But also letting the forest change if certain native species do better to not try and coerce it to a different sort of a different group of species to sort of let what natives you see do well, use that as a signal for maybe what you should let grow. Okay, I'll highlight a handful with the time that I have of different species, and then we'll do one last pivot to just some more practical recommendations in terms of where to find some of these trees and what to do when you have them. So, I'm going to start with sort of the largest and move down to smallest. First up is shagbark hickory. Hickory is another keystone species that doesn't get enough attention in Maine. There's a couple species that are native to Maine technically, but shagbark hickory is the most common that you'll encounter. It's a very large tree, but it's pretty slow growing. It's a tree you plant for your children and your children's children that provides these large nuts, which are important for as wildlife food, and they're edible for people as well. And the leaves are eaten by many, many, hundreds of species of moth and butterfly benefit from eating hickory leaves. And the tree just provides beauty all 4 seasons long because of this shaggy bark. It provides a really unique texture to your landscape and is kind of instantly recognizable once you've seen it. Next up, we have a couple oak species. As I mentioned, I always like to promote oak. I think many folks think of them as being very slow growing and maybe lacking some of that, fall foliage luster that maples get so much attention for. But I think, mixing them in with your maples and other trees, they can provide a really nice contrast and nice sort of, coppery fall colors, which is great. And also, they're extremely drought tolerant. So bur oak on the left here is especially drought tolerant, can really handle anything, requires very, no irrigation once it's established, and does really well with soil compaction, can handle being planted near roads. So, hill strips and along boulevards. It's an excellent tree. Will grow too tall to be planted under power lines. But again, really excellent food source for butterflies and moths. Swamp white oak is a little bit less drought tolerant, as the name implies, does better in, near rain gardens and wetter depressions, and has this really unique, white underside to its leaves. Sassafras is one of my favorites. It is just a super unique tree, has these yellow flowers and three different sort of forms to its leaves. It can have no lobes, it can have one lobe where it looks like a mitten, and it can have these two lobes, three lobes right here in front here that you see in the picture. So very interesting leaf shape, this beautiful fall, sort of yellowish, orangish fall color. And if you rub the leaves, I think they smell like Fruit Loops, very aromatic foliage. And the roots used to be made into a tea that evolved into flavoring for our original root beer. Um, it was found that the roots, the compounds in sassafras roots are actually a carcinogen, so thankfully we don't use it for root beer anymore, but it's sort of an interesting fact about the early history of the tree. Striped maple also is one of our favorites. It's part of our logo at Wild Seed Project because of this sort of chain of samaras that it creates sort of unique among maples for having its seeds sort of dangle like that. And it's also called the goose foot maple or the moose maple or the snakebark maple. It has a lot of different names. And the bark is really cool. So even in the winter, the bark has stripes along it, and it can photosynthesize. So when it's young, it's green, has green bark. And so it makes just a really excellent understory tree for a shady spot in your garden. Another one I like to point out is black gum. This is a tree you might find in wetter areas, near wetlands. Sometimes can even see it more towards coastal areas because of its salt tolerance. This tree is really tough as nails. It can handle really anything, especially in urban settings with soil compaction, flooding, you know, all of that it can handle in stride. And it grows to more medium height. So while probably still not good under power lines, it fits a lot better in urban spaces. And it's also called Tupelo or sour gum, and its fall color is really dramatic and really striking. Photos don't do it justice. It's sort of a just a unique red apart from what you see on our maples. And I think, evergreens kind of get the short stick in terms of being seen as being valuable for wildlife. But cedar, red cedar, and also white cedar are very, very highly used for like nesting sites for birds, as well as just shelter in general, all 4 seasons, because they provide this dense structure in the wintertime. And of course, these also tough as nails. You'll find them along the coast because of how salt tolerant they are. And um, yeah, as I said, they provide cover for birds, but also provide winter forage from their berry-like cones that red cedar produces. Getting more into smaller trees that could do well under power lines, we have serviceberry. There's several different species of serviceberry. All of them are on the smaller end. They're all surprisingly drought and salt tolerant, and they provide interest kind of all year long. They are one of our earliest flowering trees, so they provide pollen for some of the first bees to emerge in the spring, which is really important. And by attracting all those insects, they'll also attract warblers and other insect-eating birds to your yard. And those flowers develop into these berries, which are cherished by thrushes and other birds. People can eat them too. And then the leaves are a great food source for a lot of caterpillars. All right, getting to the last couple here. Pagoda dogwood is another favorite shade tree of mine. Handles kind of a lot of soils, but average garden conditions it will do really well in, and prefers that part shade to shade under street trees. It will be completely happy. It does require a little bit cooler moisture conditions, so it's not going to do well in exposed locations or areas where the soil will get really warm. But if you have a spot that's a little bit more sheltered, a little bit cooler, it'll create these beautiful tiers of foliage that will catch snow in the wintertime and be really beautiful. Finally, just want to give a plug to beach plum. It's kind of a relatively unknown native tree that only gets, about 10 feet tall. And so you can plant it right near your house like you would a shrub. But it produces these really delicious plums. You will require it will require full sun and well-draining soil. So if you're in South Portland or somewhere that is really sandy, this is an excellent plant. It used to be a lot more common along the coast before development, and it really deserves being brought back in to our spaces. And now finally, just a few kind of practical notes that I want to point out before wrapping things up. As I mentioned, kind of don't need to go over this again, but you really do want to understand your site before you pick a tree. Um, you know, try and I'm guilty of it just as much as the next person, but try not to get your heart set on certain trees, certain plants before you know more about your space. Take some time. If you're new to your space, spend some time outside. Look at how the sun changes throughout the day. Now is a wonderful time to assess how much light your yard gets because we're almost at summer solstice. And so we're really getting a good idea of what's in full sun, what doesn't get sun. during the main growing season. But also just like what stressors you have, road salt, compaction, do you have shade from conifers or buildings, which is deep shade, versus shade from deciduous trees, which is, you know, a little bit less deep shades, a little bit more tolerant of a lot of shrubs and small trees. That sort of thing is just really important before you go out and purchase plants. And where to buy these trees, we get this question a lot with all of our suggestions. We have a resource on our website, wildseaproject.net. If you go to our resources tab, there's a where to buy native plants resource. So um, even if you don't live in Maine, we have a registry of native plant nurseries throughout the Northeast that you can check out. And this here, these spring native plant sales have all passed. But just an example of just some of the native plant sales that happen in Maine. We have our live plant sale September 7th this year, and we are increasingly having more and more in shrub and tree species available for purchase. But other really popular and great choices are Fedco. They have mail order plants. Purchase them in the winter and they mail them to you in March. But there's also the New Hampshire State Nursery, grows whips of a lot of more common native trees, but they're very affordable. We're talking a handful of dollars for a tree. And so you have many, many options. We just recommend that you go with reputable and um, ideally local places so that we support all these growers that are working hard to grow native plants. And I just have a couple more minutes here. I want to make space for questions, but when you have your tree, especially if it's in a container, you want to make sure that you assess the root ball, make sure it's not root bound, and if it is, with a knife, make some X's in the root ball so that there's some space for it to expand outward and not suffocate itself. It's very important. Typically, people plant trees too deep. You want to plant to where the root flare is exposed. It should be above the soil surface. That's where the trunk starts to flare out and where the buttresses of the roots start to extend outward. You want that just above the soil surface. If you don't, you see this picture on the bottom right, the tree will actually create new roots towards the surface, and commonly those roots will encircle the stem when it's covered with mulch or when it's covered with dirt. And that's problematic because as they encircle the stem of the tree, it essentially suffocates itself and girdles itself. And that's why you'll see a lot of times newly planted trees will start to die within, say, 5 years of being planted. And so it's a common problem and one that I like to point out. Another good practice is to dig a much wider hole than you think so that you're loosening the soil around the root ball and letting those lateral roots. It gives the tree space to really stretch out those lateral roots. The other thing I like to say is just please say no to mulch volcanoes, to piling mulch up against the stem of the tree. Once you know what these are, you'll see them everywhere. And that creates the same problem I mentioned about planting the tree too deep. The mulch creates a wet, stagnant environment, and the tree will grow roots in response. And those roots, again, will wrap around and oftentimes girdle the tree. Other times, it may create conditions where pests like to proliferate and the bark might start to decay. And again, doesn't make for a healthy tree. So only do 2 to 3 inches of mulch and keep it away from the stem of the tree. Finally, just make sure to protect the tree. I like to use hardware cloth. So the picture on the upper left is an example of hardware cloth that you can buy at the hardware store. And you just dig about 3 to 6 inches as you're planting the tree, submerge the hardware cloth into the ground, and that will protect from voles and other things that like to go and chew around and essentially girdle the tree before it's even had a chance to get established. They work great for voles, moles, mice, other things. And then the coarser fencing on the right is great if you have a lot of deer pressure. Um, but perhaps the most important, especially in a residential area, is to protect trees from people. People will mow, people will step over and step on trees, people will back into trees, all sorts of things. So anything you can do to make a tree obvious, as obvious as possible, so people don't run into it, all the better. And yeah, really, I like to just end with this contrast of what I think of as not a climate resilient planting and what is. On the left, we have a birch that has succumbed to bronze birch borer, an insect that bores into the tree and eventually cuts the tree off from being able to get water and nutrients. That birch was planted in a sunny, dry, exposed location, and it was stressed. And because it got stressed, it became susceptible to disease. Um, that tree has no other vegetation around it. It's treated like it lives on an island. And it's not creating the habitat, especially now that it's dead, that wildlife depend upon. Contrast that with the right side, we have multiple layers of vegetation. We have canopy trees, we have shrubs, we have ground cover that's providing habitat, providing dense and complex areas where animals can find food and find shelter. And that to me is something that's a lot more resilient. And even if one of those trees dies out because of stress, there'll be something that can come up and take its place. So if you leave today wanting to learn more, I'd like to point you to our website where we have a bunch of free resources. We also have our annual print publications that come out in April every year. Our most recent one this year was Gardening for Biodiversity, about some of the things that we talked about today, but it goes in a lot more detail. And yeah, please check out our events page. We have events throughout the summer where you can get more involved with everything that we're talking about today. So, with that, thank you all and happy to take a few questions.
Thanks so much, Tyler. And folks, feel free to unmute yourself or type your question in the chat box.
Betty, do you have a question?
I have a very odd question, but looking at the list of participants, we're almost all women. um, and I just wondered, in terms of I'm a member of Wild Seed Project, just in terms of outreach and who we're need to convince on some of this and who's doing all the work. That just struck me that I think there are only, beside yourself, a couple of names that look like males anyway. So I guess we should get a lot of applause for uh, caring about the environment. Um, no, I had a question about oaks. We have I'm on the shore by in Harpswell, and a very large, a huge oak tree, which I didn't see you mention. It wasn't one of the ones. It's not a swamp oak. Um, and whether I'm assuming it's native, but I just wondered about other kinds of oaks that might be useful and
Yeah. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I mean, to your first point, it is always interesting, the sort of audience composition. Yeah, you definitely it's been promising. Some of our events, we get a lot more diversity both in age as well as gender and other backgrounds. So that's excellent to see. Um, and yeah, it's funny. I dabble both in like keeping fish in an aquarium, which for whatever reason is very male dominated, to gardening, which tends to be more female dominated. And it's interesting how those dynamics play out. In terms of the oak, most likely it's red oak, which is the most common oak in Maine. You can kind of identify it both by its leaves have, they almost look like little hairs or very sharp points at the end of the lobes, versus white oak, which will have very rounded, wavy lobes. Red oak also has what are called ski tracks along the trunk. If you look up the trunk, you should see vertical lines going up and down, especially on mature red oaks. So that's what I would kind of be my first inkling of what it is. But like I said, we have white oak in drier areas. We do have some chestnut oaks and scrub oaks, which barely get into Maine, much more of a Cape Cod phenomenon. And scrub oaks only get maybe 6 feet tall, 10 feet tall. So that's certainly not it. But just mentioning a few other oaks that are native to our area.
Tyler, there's a question in the chat from Shannon. Is there any native species mentioned that have shown that they may not be able to adapt to our changing climate?
Yeah, well, kind of the most obvious examples are species that really prefer and only currently exist at higher elevations in Maine or in cool areas in Maine. Um, so I'm thinking about our spruces, uh, white spruce, but also to a lesser degree, black and red spruce. But you have things like um, balsam fir and hemlock, which for other reasons, hemlock is not doing well in terms of the threat of hemlock woolly adelgid. So in many ways, it's the one-two punch of non-native pests and pathogens plus climate changes that are kind of hitting the canaries in the coal mine, if you will, of our hemlocks, our ash trees, and it's already wiped out our chestnut. Um, but those are the species that I think are most at risk. And then following those up with some of the really cold tolerant conifer species that currently are only, are only in more northerly Maine. And so they're at risk of getting pushed out as the climate warms. Good question.
I had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. On the Norway maple, do you ever tell people how to easily ID it by the latex? You wear that?
Yeah, no, that is an excellent way to identify it. So what Karen's talking about is, take one of the leaves off the stem and look at where the leaf connects to the stem, and you should see white latex, almost like a milkweed, coming off the tip. And that is a good diagnostic that differentiates Norway maple, our non-native maple, from sugar maple, red maple, silver maple, our native maple species. Because yeah, you're right. They're not all the purple foliage cultivar. In fact, if you let them seed themselves, a lot of the seedlings you'll see are green because that's what the tree kind of wants to be because it's more efficient in terms of photosynthesis. But the red is what was selected for and bred because it's gorgeous, no doubt. Just unfortunately, they're invasive and they spread and choke out our native species. So good point, Karen.
Thank you. The property I live on, I've noticed in the woods, the maple trees then you look at it, well, which one is it? Maple or sugar? Red maple, sugar maple.
Yeah.
Then you pick a leaf and squeeze it, and the latex comes out. It's Norway maple. I mean, they really are getting invasive around here. I live in Bucksport, like the mid coast. So
Okay. Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, they do very well in Maine. They're very, very abundant for sure. Alan, did you have a question? We maybe have what, one more time for one more question? Oh,
Oh,
we're
yeah,
pretty.
hi. So for the past few weeks, I've been watching squirrels feast on the samaras on the silver maple that I have outside one of my windows. And as those samaras have been depleted and some have fallen to the ground, they've been eating them on the ground. But right next to it is, and I planted the silver maple. Next to it is a Norway maple that I did not plant. Um, and its samaras are forming now. They're not quite ripe yet. They're still very, very green. So my question is, I know it's an invasive species on the do not sell list. Are the leaves as well as samaras any less or more palatable to the native wildlife?
I don't know. It would be interesting. It'd certainly be an interesting anecdote for you to see what, if anything, eats
Yeah.
them in your yard. I don't know of any research that I've read where they've actually studied that sort of thing.
Mhm.
They certainly have not studied the leaf color cultivar that I mentioned. Other plants, like nine bark, the shrub, has a dark color cultivar that has been studied, and some other wildflowers have been studied where they've shown that it's less nutritious for insects, especially specialty insects that only feed on those
Right.
species. And so, beyond all of that, I would just say that there are specialist insects that only feed on sugar maple, red maple, like the rosy maple moth, that will not be getting benefits from Norway maple. Um, Mammals can sometimes be a little bit more opportunistic. They might eat the seeds no matter what, but certainly it impacts our insects pretty directly. And
Right.
that latex is probably not helping it be palatable for a lot of them. So,
Okay.
good
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tyler.